The Chicago Bears aren't in a position to give away a ton of future assets at the NFL trade deadline. But that doesn't mean there aren't other players around the league they could take a look at as potential long-term pieces to add to this team.
You are Locked On Bears, your daily Chicago Bears podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
This is Locked On Bears, and I'm your host, Lorin Cox. I'm here to bring you your daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. You can follow me on Twitter at CoxSports1. You can follow the podcast on Twitter at Locked On Bears. You can like Locked On Bears on Facebook. Join the Locked On Bears Facebook group for even more Bears talk. And make sure you hit that subscribe button on the Locked On Bears YouTube channel to keep up with all of our video podcasts as well. Thanks for making the Locked On Bears podcast your first listen today. Today's episode is brought to you by LinkedIn. LinkedIn Jobs helps you find the candidates you want to talk to faster. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedonnfl. On the show today, we sort of do the reverse of what we did on yesterday's podcast. Yesterday, we looked at players the Bears could trade away, players that would be options for other teams looking at taking from the Bears before the trade deadline, which I believe is November 1st. So it's not right around the corner, but this is the time when the rumors are swirling and teams are having those conversations. Today, we'll look at players the Bears could or should look at from other teams. Not that the Bears are in a position to trade away high draft picks. They want to have as many draft picks as possible and are likely to be more sellers than buyers at the trade deadline. But that doesn't mean there aren't players out there that could be good value for the Bears to trade for now to get a look at, have them in the building this season and see what they have to see if they belong as long-term fits and maybe upgrade this team a little bit along the way in the process. We'll look at some receivers, some offensive linemen, a few tight ends perhaps that could be on that market, and a couple of defensive players as well, kind of glancing around the roster at some spots where there's either good value or needed upgrades for the Chicago Bears. It's important to keep in mind the full context here, right? That the Bears are not going to trade away first-round pick, second-round pick type of deals for players. The Bears are not in a position to trade for someone to put them over the top, to try and, make the playoffs this season or to try and, be a true contender. We kind of know that this Bears team is more about building for the long-term future. And so when we start to talk about these players, the idea is not acquire them so you can win more games in 2022. The idea is more like acquire them to see if you can use the rest of the season to determine whether or not they belong as, long-term pieces for your team for 2023 and beyond. So it's a little bit of a different conversation than some of the teams that might be contending for the Super Bowl and need one more big player to put them over the top. I think from a Bears perspective, what you're looking at is just, can I get a good deal on a player that, I wouldn't have to give up a huge draft pick to get necessarily, or at least would give up less in compensation for them than you might otherwise need to when it comes to trying to sign them in free agency or acquire them at another time when their value might be higher on their current team. Because you look around the NFL right now, and certainly the Bears are not the only team in the league that needs more at wide receiver, but they're kind of, I don't know if quietly or if it's just my perception of quietly, but like you start looking around and there's a fair number of options to trade for a wide receiver that I guess the number of them was more than I thought there would be when I started looking around. Doesn't mean there's a bunch of true number one receivers that are going to come in and completely change your wide receiver room. But there are guys out there that you're like, okay, like I would be interested in potentially bringing them to Chicago if the price is right. And that's the most important caveat in all of this is you don't want to overspend and give up too much to acquire any of these players. But if these players were available for a day 3 draft pick or some sort of appropriate value, which varies by player, you would definitely have to consider it. Like, I think the biggest name out there that would be more than a day 3 draft pick is DJ Moore from the Carolina Panthers. After they fired their head coach, Matt Rule, sort of the feeling is that, like, yeah, it's potentially a fire sale in Carolina. and some of their more expensive veteran players could be available. Now, DJ Moore is a player they just signed to a contract extension, and it's likely he's not nearly as available, perhaps, as people on the outside may want to speculate and rumor stir and all that stuff. Like, I don't think the Panthers are in a hurry to trade away DJ Moore. And so we're not going to spend a ton of time going through there, but I think it's important to keep in mind that, perhaps Carolina would be more inclined to get rid of him now than they would have been before, given how much could be in flux there. And perhaps if they could get a more premium draft pick for him, they would be more willing to do so. The Bears are not one of those teams in a position to give up a premium draft pick for DJ Moore, because other teams might be more desperate to give up more to have him put them over the top. Whereas the Bears would be more a long-term home, right? Where they could afford to pay when his salary goes up a lot more next season. He could be that type of difference maker at wide receiver. But if you're looking for, the more affordable, the lower value, but could still be upgrades for the Bears that you could be long-term players if they can come in here and figure out what they are by the rest of the year. Of course, we've heard a lot about Denzel Mims from the New York Jets, a guy that we talked about in the preseason as a trade option, and his role in New York still hasn't really expanded into something greater, and he's still just kind of more or less hanging out and could be really good value for a team like the Bears, a former second-round pick with good route running skills that I particularly liked coming out of the draft, and I'm sure a number of teams around the league have their eye on what he could do. Or even another Carolina Panthers receiver, Terence Marshall, was their second-round pick a couple years ago. He's kind of slipped through the cracks a little bit there, and this is another one of these that he's not the DJ Moore level of wide receiver, so maybe he's a little easier to get out, but he's also one of these younger receivers, but hasn't cracked a bigger role in their offense. So it's kind of tough to get a sense of what is and isn't available with the Carolina Panthers. A few others, real quick, I want to run through. Kendrick Bourne from the New England Patriots, and Nelson Aguilar from the Patriots has also been thrown out there as a potential trade option at this time of year, because both guys haven't had as big of an impact at receiver. They have Devontae Parker. They drafted Tyquan Thornton in the second round. Bourne, I think, has slipped even more through the cracks there. Aguilar carries a little bit more name recognition, but Bourne is a type of player that is not going to come in and be a number one, but could be an upgrade over what the Bears have and might be more easy to get out of New England for a lesser draft pick compensation. There's also Darius Slayton from the New York Giants, who we weren't sure would make the Giants 53, has the connection to the Bears wide receivers coach Tyke Tolbert, who coached him in New York. The Giants receiving core is not very good, but even in that, Slayton has not been able to sort of reemerge as the talented receiver that we've seen him play at up to this point in his career. We also preseason talked about Marquez Callaway from the New Orleans Saints as a potential option here that wasn't sure if he was going to make the 53 or not. Did make the final roster, but hasn't played a ton in that offense because they have Michael Thomas and Jarvis Landry and Chris Olave and Traquan Smith, their third-round pick from a couple of years ago now. Like, Callaway kind of finds himself like fifth on that depth chart and was like a 600, 800-yard receiver a couple of seasons ago in what was a banged-up Saints wide receiving core. So if you could get good value for him, he could be an upgrade for this Bears wide receiving core. And you throw out Chase Claypool from the Steelers as well as a name in this mix that a lot of these wide receiver needy teams are going to be looking across the board. But I just mentioned 7 guys there, sort of 8 when you count the 2 Patriots receivers. Like, there are receivers out there. So maybe, the Bears aren't going to get into a bidding war for any of them. They're not in a position to pay a premium trade capital for a young receiver. But could any of those guys be upgrades over Dante Pettis and now the waived Emir Smith-Marset? Absolutely. Not to put the Bears over the top to make the playoffs this season, but to give them another receiver to look at as a potential long-term option to pair with Darnell Mooney and whoever else might be available in free agency this year and the NFL draft after that. It's not just at wide receiver, though. There's some guys up front on the offensive line, some sneaky good talent at the tight end position the Bears could look at, and some defensive players as well. We'll get through all of them and more next on Locked On Bears. These days, every new potential hire can feel like a high-stakes wager for your small business. You want to be 100% certain that you have access to the best qualified candidates available. That's why you have to check out LinkedIn Jobs. LinkedIn Jobs helps find the right people for your team faster and for free. I'm on LinkedIn. I'm guessing you might be on LinkedIn as well. And if you're not, I know that you know many people who are also on LinkedIn. It's why small businesses rate LinkedIn jobs #1 in delivering quality hires versus the leading competitors, because they've got really easy to use tools like screening questions that make it easy to focus on the candidates with just the right skills and experience, so you can quickly prioritize who you'd like to interview and hire. LinkedIn Jobs helps you find the qualified candidates you want to talk to faster. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedonnfl. That's linkedin.com/lockedonnfl to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. It's easy to talk about the wide receivers, right? That's the obvious position where the Bears could use some help, along with offensive line, but a wide receiver is certainly where there's more easier names to find, right? I mean, the fantasy football world we live in now puts that wide receiver group front and center. It's a little bit hard to, go out and find great offensive line options because there's generally more of a shortage of offensive line talent in the NFL, and teams generally don't trade away good offensive linemen when they have them because they're starting, because you need 5 good ones, and most teams can barely have 5 good ones and don't typically have extras. But a couple of names jump to mind as, not that these are guys that are necessarily about to be traded for sure and are for sure going to be on the block, but guys that maybe could be available options as this season goes on, some more likely than others, right? So I think first and foremost, the price tag on this one might end up being higher than the Bears might like, but it certainly could provide a more long-term option for the team. When you look at the Philadelphia Eagles right now, they have 3 starting caliber offensive tackles on their roster. And last I know, you can only start 2 of them. I mean, I guess you could move one to guard, but there's only 2 tackle spots, and they like their guards as well. And they've got Andre Dillard coming off of the injury, and he's kind of on the bench right now. Jordan Mailata, I never know how to pronounce his last name. It's kind of one of those, island type names. Jordan Mailata. Malata. I'm not. He was an Australian rugby rules player, but he's been a really solid left tackle for them. But Andre Dillard was their first round pick in 2019. So Mailata was a 7th round pick a couple years ago, but playing really well. And then of course Lane Johnson is their right tackle, and presumably they can't play all 3. And are they just going to keep rolling with all 3? I mean, I think they're certainly willing to do that, but could you pry away one of their 3 offensive tackles? I'm not even sure exactly which one they would be most willing to get rid of, but again, it's sort of 3 and you only need 2. And they also have, Jack Driscoll is their 4th round pick a couple years ago. They have pretty darn good offensive line depth in Philadelphia, and maybe could you pry one out there? I mean, I think it's a possibility. It might be more of a draft pick compensation than the Bears want to give up, and maybe a team that's trying to compete for a Super Bowl this year and is more desperate would be more willing to give up a more significant draft pick for one of them. But you're talking about a clear-cut upgrade over everything the Bears have at offensive tackle. And with either guy, they're young, and it's not like you're just trading for them for this year, right? They can be 5 to 10 year offensive tackle starters for you and really shore up a key position on the offensive line. And maybe you move Larry Borum to guard, or there's a sort of ripple effect you could have there, but more importantly, just makes the offensive tackle position better for the Bears. There weren't a lot of guards in general that were standing out to me, even though that's the more, important, or the more difficult, the bigger need is the word I'm looking for this Bears offensive line right now. But I don't know, I wasn't seeing a ton. Maybe there's more out there that I'm not seeing at the moment, but another tackle that stands out, Josh Jones from the Arizona Cardinals, sitting on the bench for them. 3rd round pick in 2020. Not that he's a Pro Bowl player, just sitting there waiting on the bench, but a guy who I think he has some positional versatility as well. I think he played some guard in college, if I remember correctly, but could come in and be a potential upgrade for the Bears at offensive tackle. They're starting DJ Humphries and Calvin Beachum at their 2 tackle spots, and the 3rd round pick is just sitting there kind of twiddling his thumbs, waiting for his opportunity. Could they be more inclined to give up that player for either draft pick compensation or maybe a player to kind of try and upgrade their team that would actually play this season, as opposed to a tackle that's sitting on the bench for them? The other one that I'll throw out that's maybe a little bit of a longer shot, but there's been long rumors of sort of a disgruntled situation here, and maybe he's going to be a free agent, and maybe the contract situation just isn't going to play out for them. But Isaiah Wynn from the New England Patriots, he's their starting right tackle right now. They do have Marcus Cannon on the bench behind him, a veteran who they have relied on before in the past. So maybe they could be more willing to move on from Isaiah Wynn. But to me, it's hard to take a starting offensive tackle away from a team that's playing pretty well. That the Bears also happen to play this upcoming Monday, but Wynn was their first round pick in 2018. I think a really talented offensive lineman. But there's long been rumors of a rift with him and the Patriots team, and that perhaps when he hits free agency this offseason, he might not end up sticking around, and the Bears could trade for him, get him in the building, see how he does, and then potentially give him that long-term contract extension from there. Those three were kind of the big three for offensive linemen that stuck out for me. But as I was looking around at other players that could be available, I think there could be some real value in the tight end trade market. It's certainly not the biggest need on the Chicago Bears right now, but clearly you're not getting a ton of production from Cole Kmet. Doesn't necessarily mean he can't still, at some point, turn it around and be more. But I think from a Bears offensive perspective, right, you can always add more weapons. Whether that weapon is a wide receiver, a tight end, or maybe a pass-catching running back, not in the trade market, but you know what I mean? Like anybody who can catch passes, regardless of where they line up, could add value to this Bears offense because they just need players who can get open, catch passes, and make plays after the catch. And there's a few tight ends out there that just seem to be available that could be good value for three teams that maybe just are not necessarily like trying to get rid of them, but are very willing to get rid of them that could be at a good price for the type of player you're going to get. The big fish would be Mike Gesicki from the Miami Dolphins. Mike McDaniel down there wants more of like a inline Cole Kmet style of blocking tight end, and Gesicki is kind of the Jimmy Graham style borderline wide receiver, split him out in the slot type of receiver weapon at tight end that's not as good of a blocker, but the Bears could use anybody that can catch passes consistently. Gesicki's pretty darn good, and he was a former second-round pick, if I remember correctly, and still, a very talented player. It's just more like, it feels kind of like the Greg Olsen thing when the Bears traded away Greg Olsen. It's like he's really good, and maybe the coach is a little stubborn about trying to fit him in, but certainly not trying to compare Mike McDaniel to Mike Martz in that regard. But, that feeling of like, hey, he's a really good pass catcher, and whoever gets him will likely be able to use him more or better and get more out of him than we're seeing in Miami right now. But given his pedigree, maybe the compensation's a little bit out of the Bears' range. But a couple of guys that could be more in the Bears' range. I look at Albert O from the Denver Broncos. Albert Aquinguambunam, the Missouri tight end who everyone just calls Albert O because his last name is like Giannis Antetokounmpo from the Milwaukee Bucks. It's just like I'm going to need to sit down and practice it for 25 minutes before the podcast in order to say it right. They traded, he was involved, after the Russell Wilson trade, they traded away Noah Fant, and it was like, okay, this is Albert O's time to shine. And his snaps have slowly gone down, down, and down as the Broncos offense has struggled more and more. He's young, big, has some of that blocking upside. Not a dynamic athlete just yet at the tight end position, and maybe never will be, but young player with perhaps some untapped upside there. And we get the sense that the Bears offense would like to use more multiple tight end sets. But, the guys they have, Ryan Griffin's been hurt a little bit, and the likes of Jake Tongas and Trevin Wesco just aren't difference makers really at the position. They're just guys. And Albert O could give you something to be a little bit more excited about. And I'll throw out Austin Hooper, Tennessee Titans. Signed him to a one-year deal this offseason. Has been pretty disappointing for them. He's a guy that a lot of Bears fans identified in free agency as a potential target. Never really quite happened, but it's kind of been a little bit underwhelming there. But we've seen him be very good with the Atlanta Falcons earlier in his career, and another pass-catching type tight end that would be fun to see as just another weapon for that Chicago Bears offense. And the likes of Hooper and Albert O might be a little bit easier, more affordable in terms of trade compensation than the likes of Mike Gesicki. I don't think the Bears need to keep their focus limited purely to offensive upgrades. Just look for, younger players or high upside guys that you might be able to get at a good value for the type of player you're going to go after on the trade market. And we'll look at some of those defensive options for the Bears to just keep this team building process going next on Locked On Bears. Locked On Bears podcast is brought to you by our friends at BetOnline.net, the number one source for all of your sports betting needs. As we look ahead to this Bears-Patriots matchup, it's going to be, I think, a tough one for what the Bears are looking at, in a game like this where, the Patriots are 8.5-point favorites at BetOnline. The money line has Patriots minus 370, Bears plus 300 if you want to bet on that straight up upset. The over-under set at 40 points, and we've seen how Bears games have struggled to reach even 40 points in that game. If you like those odds, our friends at betonline.net are going to be the top spot for all of the latest player developments, team matchups, news, in-depth articles, and analysis on every game you can find, not just the Bears, but across the NFL, Major League Baseball playoffs, the NBA season and NHL seasons just getting started, plus all of your combat sports, golf, live in-game betting as well to make it that much more fun on your game days. So head on over to betonline.net or use your mobile device to learn more about all the different trends and action happening every single day. BetOnline, where the game starts. When you start looking around at defensive players that could be available at the trade deadline here, there's some real intriguing names there that catch your eye, and you're like, oh man, like if you could get good value on a player like that, absolutely bring them in and see what they might be able to do in Chicago. See if they belong as a long-term fit in this defense. Like you look at the Las Vegas Raiders, when they fired John Gruden and Mike Mayock, there's still some holdovers from their drafts, and one of the big disappointments there was one of their first-round picks, Cleland Farrell, and really kind of fallen out of the rotation there. And the question with him is scheme fit. They're trying to make him a 4-3 defensive end in Vegas, and the thought is that he would be a better fit in a 3-4 at that 5 technique defensive end. And so, the Bears obviously don't offer that. I wondered if you could make him an interior pass rusher, or you could try and scheme some different things for him at that defensive end spot, but just say, give him a fresh start in Chicago and see what he can do, as he too is running on the end of his rookie contract. And it doesn't seem like the Raiders really want to keep him around, but first round pedigree. I mean, everyone kind of, during that draft, when they drafted Farrell in the first round, everyone pretty universally thought that was a reach. So I don't want to call him like a bona fide first round player, but people thought he'd be like a second round pick at least, like, a top 50 type guy, even if he's not a top 30 type guy like he was drafted. Raw talent, bring him into Chicago, see if you can unlock something a little more for him. If you could get really good trade value for a former first round pick, why not take a flyer on a player quite like that? Another former first round pick that wouldn't have the same high value type trade, but there's been a surprising number of rumors that this player was available, is someone the Bears played on Thursday night, the Washington Commanders. Their nose tackle, Daron Payne, the former Alabama nose tackle for them. Not that Washington doesn't want him or like him or that he hasn't been playing well. I mean, he's a very, very good defensive tackle, and he was one of the tackles getting a lot of that interior pressure on Justin Fields. But the thought process with Daron Payne is twofold. One, Washington is not very good and is not competing for a Super Bowl this year and may end up moving on from Ron Rivera at some point if they keep losing football games. And the other side of that is that the Washington Commanders already paid their other defensive tackle, Jonathan Allen, the other Alabama offensive tackle. They gave him a big contract extension. And so the feeling is are they going to want to give a second defensive tackle another big contract extension? Can they afford, or will they be interested in, designating that much money at the defensive tackle position in 2 players on really big defensive tackle contracts? And the Bears don't have good defensive tackles. They certainly don't have good nose tackles. And, the 3 technique spot with Justin Jones is hit and miss right now. It's still to be determined whether he's a long-term guy. But Daron Payne's a first-round talent, and it's not going to be cheap. It's not going to be great value to trade for him, but if you can get some kind of good deal on a first-round level nose tackle a nose tackle with some pass rushing upside there, that would be a nice ROI. Probably out of the Bears price tag, but a name that is going to be floated around in a lot of these rumor discussions that certainly would call on, at least see what that compensation might look for. If you want a more affordable defensive tackle, a guy I absolutely loved coming out of the draft that I was really good early in his career, actually was with the Washington Commanders and then jumped over to the Carolina Panthers this past year in free agency, I think just on a 1-year deal, is Matt Ioannidis, defensive tackle from Temple. Just kind of a crafty interior pass rusher who just finds a way to make plays and get pressure on quarterbacks. I have advocated for the Bears to bring him in as a free agent. Would love to get him in a trade. And he's, again, kind of just rotational in Carolina right now. They do have some pretty good defensive tackle talent there. They drafted Derek Brown in the first round and have used some other picks on the defensive line in general. So like he's not having as premier of a role there, and would love to see him in Chicago. And I just, as a guy who signed kind of a cheaper free agent deal, I can't imagine he would be super expensive to go over and bring in. One other defensive lineman I want to throw out there, because of the Matt Eberflus connection, you look at the Indianapolis Colts. They have a defensive end, Ben Benogu. Matt Eberflus was there when they drafted him in the second round in 2019. He has not lived up to his second round draft billing. He was out of TCU. He's kind of a tweener. He's like 6'3", 250 pounds. So a little small, but not quite too small. And he's got some athleticism. Like he hasn't found that natural fit in the NFL. And you wouldn't trade for him thinking he's going to be an instant like star at the defensive end spot. But like clearly he's fallen behind there. He's down in the rotation and not playing that much. If Matt Eberflus believes in him, thinks he's got that upside, certainly would have a better sense of that than most other coaches in the NFL. Only with the Matt Eberflus seal of approval do you make that trade, because you could get, a second-round talent at what will likely be a drastically reduced trade price for a player like that who could rotate in at defensive end, especially if, like we talked about yesterday, Robert Quinn ends up on his way out at the trade deadline. The Bears trade him away for draft picks. You could add a guy like Ben Benogu and add him to that rotation, not to like fully replace Robert Quinn, but to get another slightly more experienced player with some snaps there and some talent and some pedigree that, you can kind of get a sense of what can he and can he not do for your organization. A couple other guys on defense, not on that defensive line, that jumped out to me as available. Cornerbacks, Sidney Jones from the Seahawks and Bryce Hall from the New York Jets. Both young players, both that I think have a lot of upside still, not really getting fully utilized on their teams, have fallen off the depth chart. The Bears, we're slowly feeling better about their cornerbacks. I mean, of course, Jalen Johnson's great. Kyler Gordon, over the last couple of weeks, has bounced back a little bit. And last week, I think he had his best game of the season against the Commanders. Seems to be settling into the slot. And Kindle Vildor has been much improved as an outside cornerback. And so there's not this huge need to go out and get a new starter per se. But, Sidney Jones and Bryce Hall both have a lot of that upside. So, I mean, Sidney Jones, I think, was if not a first-round pick, an early second-round pick, if I remember correctly. Bryce Hall was a fifth-rounder, but he got some playing time earlier with New York, and I thought showed some real upside there, and would love to see what he could do. They drafted Sauce Gardner in the first round this year and kind of pushed everybody else down a little bit in their depth chart. But, to get a couple other guys in there that, you just trust a little more and like the upside a little more than the likes of, Lamar Jackson and Jalen Jones, the Bears' current backup cornerbacks. You could definitely use more depth, and those guys have some starter plus potential there to compete with Kindle Vildor and maybe push him out, or maybe they just push Kindle Vildor to be that much better and offer more of a threat than undrafted free agents Lamar Jackson, Jalen Jones, and Josh Blackwell on the Bears' cornerback depth chart. Not going to trade a ton to add more at cornerback. It's not that big of a priority, but if you can get good value on good young players, that's really the theme of what we're looking at here across the roster. So there's some real talent. Wide receiver, offensive line, tight end, defensive line, cornerback. I'm not expecting, and if I had to bet money, I don't think the Bears add any significant players at the deadline. It's much more likely that they trade away a player or two at the deadline to acquire more draft picks for next season. Again, yesterday's podcast, we went through the potential players on the Bears roster that could garner draft pick compensation, including one name that I haven't really heard thrown out all that much. Although after I recorded the podcast, I saw PFF had listed that player a couple of weeks ago on a list of potential trade options for the Bears. So I will give them credit for having it first, but I hadn't seen that they had him, because I thought I came up with a pretty good one there. But of course, in the modern age, somebody always has the idea slightly before you do. But at least podcast form, you heard it here first. That's always try and give you something new, fresh, and informative here on the Locked On Bears podcast. So make sure you hit that subscribe button to keep up with all of our daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. Thanks for making the Locked On Bears podcast your first listen today. Come on back tomorrow for Crossover Thursday with Mike Debate from Locked On Patriots, and then we'll put together a game plan for how the Bears, or what the Bears need to do if they want to beat the Patriots on Monday Night Football. We'll have you all set for that primetime matchup. So come on back for that. And of course, listen again tomorrow for your next opportunity to bear down.